Welcome to another episode of Pop Goes to Legal. I try to put the exclamation point in there. Is that the right place for it? Pop Goes to Legal. We are very excited to have with us today Mona Kosar Abdi. She is a talented journalist, one of the few reporters with firsthand access to the courtroom during the trial of the century, the Sean Diddy Combs trial. In addition to that, she's across all mediums, including the co-host of Extra TV. Mona, first off, thanks for being here today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
I guess the first question is 30,000 foot view. What was the experience like of being at the trial of Sean Diddy Combs? What were a couple of your high level takeaways, and then we'll kind of get into some of the more nitty gritty.
This is one of the cases that you're going to remember and go back to, whether it's OJ or the Diddy trial. Now, I feel like it's this generation's OJ, where there was such a spectacle around it. It was so sensationalized. There were so many celebrities that were going to be mentioned, weren't mentioned. What was going to come out of this case? I think going into it, a lot of people were just wondering what curtains are going to be pulled back and what are we going to see that goes on behind closed doors. And I think every day was different. It didn't turn out to be what a lot of people thought it was going to be, but it did turn out to be a lot different and even more revealing in some ways. And then I feel like one of the moments when you think things can't get any crazier, Kanye West shows up to the downtown Manhattan courtroom. And then you're like, oh, okay, this is just has gone off the rails now. And then the verdict comes back and it took a lot of people by surprise, including myself.
Yeah, were you surprised by the verdict? I was not.
I mean, I said this offline to Mona and to Lee, I was following the trial sort of through Mona's TikTok and the testimony and like texting my friends about, what was being said on the stand that day. I want to say I was surprised, but unfortunately, I don't think I was. I mean, I feel like the testimony was very hard to hear, especially of Cassie, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. I think, getting like an inside look of what's going on behind closed doors for many years between these two people's relationships was a little bit, jarring. But ultimately, I thought that the charges against him were, sort of harder to prove for the prosecution, especially the racketeering charge. So in that aspect, I wasn't so surprised. But hearing everything, that these victims were going through was very disheartening. So I was hoping he would be, but it didn't turn out that way.
Well, he was convicted of something that carries with it potentially a fairly robust sentence, depending on what the judge does in October. Mona, what was the feeling in the courtroom when the verdict came down?
Yeah, so to elaborate a little bit, the reason why we were all surprised and realized that things could go a completely different way, because like you guys, I thought that he was going to be found not guilty on the RICO charge, and then the sex trafficking charge was kind of up in the air, but towards the end, the prosecution's case wasn't as strong as it was when Cassie took the stand, for example. But when the jury came back, I believe it was after a day and a half of deliberation, and they reached a verdict on counts 2, 3, 4, and 5. And those were the 2 sex trafficking charges and the 2 transportation and engage in prostitution charges. And they said they were deadlocked on the RICO charge. There were unpersuadable opinions on both sides. A lot of people, including myself, felt, okay, well, you won't be able to find him guilty on the RICO charge without finding him guilty on the sex trafficking charge, because sex trafficking was part of the predicate acts that the prosecution listed under the RICO charge. And so you could see the concern on Diddy's attorneys' faces when that note was read in court, that they had already reached a verdict on 4 out of the 5 counts after a day and a half of deliberating. And Diddy's head was down. His attorneys formed a circle around him. They had their hands on his shoulder. They were trying to, you could see, console him. There was a look of worry. His mother, who attended every single day of the trial, was very concerned. And at one point when he's being taken back and the marshals were escorting him out of the courtroom, she jumps up and asks him, after even just the entire hearing, and the judge explains that the jury has reached a verdict on 4 out of the 5 counts, she jumps up and asks her son, what does this mean? And then he explains it to her briefly and says, I'm going to be okay. So the next day, the jury deliberates for just 50 minutes. The day before, they said there was no way they could persuade people on either end to reach a verdict on count 1. But within 50 minutes the next day, they do reach a verdict on count one. And the foreman reads not guilty on count one. And you could feel that there was a sense of relief, and you can hear people just breathe out slightly. But it wasn't until he was found not guilty on count two, the sex trafficking charge for Cassie, that you could hear people just scream for joy, just yes. And you could see Diddy fist pump as well. And then there was still the sex trafficking charge for Jane. And once he was found not guilty, you could hear just the weight, you could just feel the weight lifted off of everyone's shoulders, his family members that were watching. And then at the end, when the judge leaves the court, he just collapses and he gets on his knees and just, as if he's praying, puts prayer hands up. His family jumps up. They give him a standing ovation. They are, you could hear tears of joy, and they were just very, very happy. And you could tell that they thought there was a high possibility that he would be spending the rest of his life in prison.
From your reporting or just kind of observing the trial, why do you think the switch flipped so fast where the jury went from essentially saying they were deadlocked to 50 minutes is very fast. I've tried probably over 20 cases in my career, and I know that we're talking about 15 minutes from deadlock to rendering a verdict, but I have never seen that happen before. So what do you think happened in those 50 minutes? What kind of led to this quick turnaround?
I can't say for sure, but I don't think it, I think it definitely helped that the 4th of July weekend was on the other side of that. So so there was a whole conversation because the court was supposed to be closed. This is Wednesday that the jury reached the verdict on the last count. Thursday, the court was closed. Friday, the court was closed. And so the judge throughout the trial said that he was going to try very hard to get the jury to enjoy their 4th of July weekend so that this trial could be over before the 4th of July. And so there was a conversation without the jurors in the courtroom where Mark Agnifilo was saying, or actually before that, the judge said, hey, I am open. If you want me to open the court and you want the jury to continue deliberating, as long as they're okay with it on Thursday, I will do that. But then we would have to come back on, I believe, Tuesday or Monday of the following week in order to continue deliberations. So then Mark Agnifilo, who is Diddy's lead attorney, said, Judge, please don't tell them that. Give them that as a last option on Wednesday at the end of the day if they decide that they still can't reach a unanimous decision on count one. Let them at first think that today is the last day. And so I do think that they were incentivized to hurry up and reach a verdict so that they could enjoy their 4th of July weekend, because they knew that if they didn't, they would come back on Monday. But again, I can't say for sure that that was the driving cause. It could be that they just needed a night of sleep and they needed to sleep on it. And so whoever it was that felt like he was guilty ended up changing their mind.
Yeah. I want to talk more about the prosecution's theory of the case and the defense theory. Before we get there, I think in any high-profile trial, whether it's OJ and now Diddy, you remember. I have a visceral memory of like witnesses testifying during the OJ trial and what they look like. Maybe it's like the various satires of that trial that I'm actually remembering, but I feel like I remember it. I think appearances matter to the public, certainly to a jury. They're going into a high profile trial, and I'm sure some of them expected, well, this is going to be a celebrity laden affair and it's kind of exciting. Once you're in the middle of it and it's the third week, it starts to probably not feel quite as exciting anymore. But I wanted to, I guess, start with Cassie, who I think for reasons relating to her pregnancy kind of testified a little bit earlier than you might have thought she was going to testify. How do you think, she's 9 months pregnant. I think she gave birth, a week after the trial or after her testimony concluded. Sitting there, what kind of reactions was her presence evoking in the jury when you were watching her testimony?
I do believe that helped the prosecutors. The fact that she was 8.5 months pregnant, taking the stand. There were times where she needed to take a break because she was just constantly fidgeting in her chair. She was uncomfortable. You could see she was just very, very pregnant. And then she's sharing some of the horrific events and things that they went through, that she had to endure during their relationship, explaining what these freak-offs were. So I definitely think in that sense, it helped the prosecution, but it also hurt the prosecution because some of the most compelling testimony, some of the testimony that I felt had the most profound effect on the jury happened during week one. And what they did is they kind of flipped everything, where Cassie went first and every other witness was to support her testimony and to corroborate some of the things that she was saying. But towards the end, they had a lot of summary witnesses, and you could see the jury losing interest. They're trying to, I will say that the 12 men and women that were part of the panel, were attentive. They were taking notes, but this was a long trial. It was 8 weeks, 8 hours a day where they're taking notes. And when it was summary witness after summary witness, it kind of, by week 6, I will say, it was hard to remember some of the either the testimony or the impact the testimony that Cassie shared had.
Yeah, Raquel, I don't know if you agree, but I think in an ideal world, you save Cassie for closer towards the end. One, you want to kind of like set up her testimony through the other witnesses, kind of lay the framework for like what the RICO charges are, kind of like more of the, I won't call it procedural, but like more of the legal witnesses that are going to establish the legal framework for a conviction. And then you hit the jury over the head with the more emotional testimony to end things, so that by the time the defense is presenting a case, and they presented a very short case, you're putting the jury more in a position of not being very happy with the defendant based on what they've heard. I think, and Mona and Raquel, I'm eager to hear if you agree with this. I think the way that it was positioned, and this is kind of out of their hands based on what was going on with Cassie, you lose a lot of that emotion, you lose a lot of that emotional tug by having her so early and then having more of the procedural witnesses come after that, and the jury starts to focus more on the law. And quite frankly, the law here was tough for the prosecution because it's a novel theory, and you lose that emotional wallop. So now the jury's focused on, well, there are some holes in the prosecution's legal theory here, and we kind of have already forgotten like how much of an impact Cassie's testimony had on us. Raquel, you're shaking your head. I don't know if you felt similarly.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to what like Mona said about the jury, sort of losing interest after Cassie's, not losing interest, but, like not, I guess, losing interest after Cassie's testimony, even at
they lose interest. I mean,
so even as someone who was like watching the case on the news or on TikTok, like after Cassie's testimony and listening to everything she had to say, like I myself, as like just like someone watching the trial unfold, lost interest as, after she gave her testimony, and then after Jane gave her testimony, and after ex-member of Donnie Bikini is gearing up to give her testimony, and then it was like, everyone was like, it's going to be explosive because she already was like, talking about Diddy in the press years prior. So as someone who was just following along like on social media or watching the news, like I myself lost an interest in the case as, more of the explosive testimony sort of like teetered off.
Yeah. And what it did, Lee, if I could just jump in real quick, is it allowed the defense, when they were cross-examining Cassie, to take it very easy on her. They did not want to come off as aggressive. They had Anna Esteveo cross-examine her, and she was almost talking to her as if they were friends, like old friends. They were laughing at times. She would insinuate or hint at certain things and try to highlight inconsistencies without coming off overly aggressive. But what it did was, when weeks passed, and as you mentioned, the emotion just wasn't as at the top of mind of the jurors, then they were able to aggressively go after Cassie. And then during the closing argument, Mark Agnifilo completely just brought out the gloves and said, Cassie is not a victim. Cassie is nobody's fool, and had a completely different approach than they did in the beginning, where they wouldn't really go after her. They knew how it would come across to the jurors if they were aggressively cross-examining a woman who's 8.5 months pregnant on the stand.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think also they did a pretty good job of distinguishing between a domestic violence case, which is how they framed this case, and what the allegations were. And I think, to your point as to why the cross-examination was maybe kids' gloves, is the initial instinct of the jury is going to be, well, this is a real victim. Like, bad stuff happened. I'm sure, jurors are told don't bring outside knowledge into a case, but like people remember the video from 2016. They're coming in thinking that something happened to her, and her testimony corroborated that she was physically assaulted throughout the course of the relationship. So there's no way to kind of like run from that or hide from that. And I think if you come out with boxing gloves on versus kid gloves on, you're making the jury dislike you from the jump as the defense, and it's very difficult for a jury to change their first impression of an attorney. They might change their impression of a case. Changing their impression of lawyers is very, very difficult. So if you come out and say, well, that was not the right way to cross-examine this witness, it would have been very damaging to their later arguments where they really needed credibility with the jury to tell the jury, look, maybe she's a domestic violence victim, or she is. They conceded that she was, but they overcharged everything else. Tough to do that if they don't like you.
Yeah. And one thing they were also able to do is establish that Sean Combs is not a good person. They didn't hide it. During their opening statements, the defense said, listen, at the end of this, you might think he's a jerk. You might think he's mean. You may not like him. But he is not on trial for being a mean person. He's not on trial for being a jerk. And so they didn't try to sugarcoat things. And Lee, as you mentioned, they did say that he was abusive, that this was a domestic violence situation, that he wasn't a good partner. And I think what also helped Diddy is some of the outside knowledge that we've had of him as kind of a shrewd businessman, someone who it doesn't take it easy on his workers, who didn't get to the top by being nice and playing nice. And I think some of the jurors might have brought that into the courtroom, because then when people were saying bad things about him, when people were, for example, some of the forced labor claims, when we had Mia, the woman who testified under the pseudonym Mia, who was a former assistant, saying, he made me work long hours. He threw things at me. Well, we kind of saw what kind of businessman he was on shows like Making the Band or I Want to Work for Diddy, where he would do similar things. He would make his future artists work long hours, or he would make them walk from Harlem to Brooklyn to get cheesecake and do these things to show their commitment. And so it wasn't as impactful as it would have been had we liked Diddy as a person beforehand.
Yeah, that's a great point. Since we're talking about the domestic violence versus RICO sex trafficking comparison, it was a little bit of a gamble for the defense to concede that even though there's no way to charge him for domestic violence at this point because we're well past statute of limitations, I think it was a little bit of a gamble for a couple of reasons for them to concede that he actually did it. Even though, the counterpoint is, well, you lose credibility if you don't concede it. But I think there maybe was a way to toe the line by saying this is a domestic violence case that's been overcharged as a sex trafficking RICO case without conceding that he committed domestic violence. Do you think that gamble paid off? Because certainly, like, the judge has, I think, harped on that concession in denying, in part in denying bond, and potentially it's going to factor heavily into the sentencing. If he adjusts the guidelines upward, I'm sure that he will go back to the concession in their opening statement and summation on this point. So do you think it was a gamble? I'm curious to hear Raquel's thoughts after. And two, do you think the gamble paid off?
It was definitely a gamble. I do think it paid off because what the defense kept harping on is that this was a 10-year relationship that was mutually toxic, that had its ups and downs. They had non-conventional sex. They were swingers. They lived a different lifestyle. They're rock stars, right? And they kept harping on the fact that this was a relationship. This wasn't sex trafficking. This wasn't someone that he was using. This was somebody that he was in love with. Same thing with Jane. This was someone who he had more of a transactional relationship. And I think we could talk about this further, but I do think that Jane eventually hurt the prosecution. She was a risky witness as well. But they established Jane as, no, this was a transactional relationship where he took care of some of the financial things in her life. But they were in a relationship and did things that couples do. I do think it did end up biting them. Again, it ended up biting them in the back when they were trying to get him out on bail. And it still, I think, we're still going to see the impact that argument had when it comes to sentencing. Now, the judge did say the factors considered to deny him bail aren't the same factors that will be considered for the sentencing. But the way the judge was talking about this case and the way that he was saying that, yes, he's been convicted of the Mann Act, but we learned so many other things during the trial that showed that he's a violent man, that he does not follow the law, that he just, I guess he harped on the fact that he is a very, very violent man. And I do think that when it comes to sentencing, some of those things may be what is considered in giving him maybe a lengthier sentence that he would have gotten.
You could say bite in the ass. It's a PG-13 rating.
Sorry, I'm like...
I mean, I'm curious to see, after everything that came out in the trial, and I think, you mentioned before that the public already had some sort of opinion on him, being a shrewd businessman and things along that nature. I'm curious to see, once he's sentenced, once he's out of jail, what's going to happen then? Like, is he going to continue to be a public facing figure? Does he retreat into privacy and just hide himself away? I'm curious to see what's on the other side of all of this, because listening to the testimony and everything even leading up to it, and hearing about whether or not it's true, the Costco shipments of baby oil that were found in his garage, and the things that he liked to engage with, and these parties that he had, and leading up to the trial and being online and seeing Ashton Kutcher is being canceled because he was at these white parties and he was involved in these freak offs, and people claiming that, maybe something happened with Justin Bieber because Diddy discovered Justin Bieber and he's probably been through so much and he was probably taken advantage of, and having all of these people start these rumor mills online and everything spiraling leading up to the trial. And now the trial happened and all this explosive information came out. How does Diddy come out of this at the other end? Is he,
Raquel, I'm concerned for your well-being after hearing you rattle all this off.
I don't know if you want me to continue on my rant, but I found myself in this 50-part TikTok hole one day about Kim Porter's allegedly not verified biography of her diary entries, and just relaying her supposed relationship with Diddy and how he maybe killed her or had her killed. So I think that
we'll do a separate conspiracy.
Yeah, this was conspiracy theories. I've fallen to that side of TikTok a lot, unfortunately. But just everything leading up to the trial, I thought was just so crazy and so unhinged. And then hearing the trial was crazy and unhinged. So I'm just curious to see what happens after.
I do think that's the $1 million question is will he come back from this? I do think that he's not going to return to the life he once had. I mean, this man was literally getting 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards right before the summer before all of this unfolded and Cassie filed her lawsuit. I don't think he'll go back to that. And partly he may have had that hotel attack video not leaked to the public. I think it's really hard to unsee the brutality and the way he was violent towards Cassie with our own eyes. I do think, though, he's not going to give up. If anything that I learned through this trial is this man does not know how to chill. I mean, he was part of his own defense team. At one point, I thought he was the lead attorney and they were all working for him. And there was one scene particularly where he's standing at the defense table during a break and he's handing papers to his attorneys and handing sticky notes. And I was like, this feels like we are in a bad boy office. He is in his main office and his attorneys are his employees walking in, because he was just had no chill. And even during cross-examination, there was a steady flow of sticky notes that he would be handing off to his attorneys. He would call them over constantly, and you could tell that he was very active. And so I don't think he's someone who just sits back and takes things. If you are familiar with his rise, he clawed his way to the top. He is someone who, even his assistants who didn't have the nicest things to say about him, said that they respected him as a businessman. So I can see him fully intended on trying to come back in some form, but I don't see the public welcoming him with open arms, and particularly Hollywood, because there's 2 schools of thoughts. There's the people who believe that there are no celebrities who really stood up and came out in his defense and said, this is not Diddy. This is not who he is. He should be freed. There were a lot of people who were trying to distance themselves, people who were close to him. We saw what happened with Jay-Z. He went full force after that civil lawsuit where he was named. Meek Mill said that, he has nothing to do with this. You mentioned Justin Bieber. Everybody was trying to just clear their own names. And then I think he became a laughingstock with the baby oil and some of the male escorts and these freak offs and what we learned about the ritualistic nature of these freak offs. Then there's also some of the homophobic allegations, right? Where, oh, what was he doing with these male escorts, or he was sexually assaulting men. And I feel like in the rap community, there's still homophobia is still very prevalent. And I don't think that there's certain rappers who want to be associated with someone who people are alleging is having sexual relations with men.
Yeah, I think we're just in a very different time now. And we were talking about some of like the over the, not even over the top, but just like the outrageous facts that came out regarding the freak offs and the baby oil and all of that stuff. I'm not going to say it's been normalized, because that, to that extent, it hasn't been. But I think there's a numbness in the public dialogue about outrageous allegations against public figures. And this is to a much lesser degree, but you think about like Louis C.K. and other celebrities who have had outrageous sexual proclivities or sexual related stories come out. And I almost feel like after the first line or two, you just kind of the public starts to forget about it a little bit. They're on to the next story. They're on to the next TikTok reel, if that's a thing. Are there TikTok reels? So I think if and when he comes out, he's certainly not going to go back to Lifetime Achievement Awards, but I just get the sense that he'll be back out there in some manner. That's my feel.
Yeah, and I could see that as well, because I do think that there is a narrative out there that he was unfairly targeted by the government as a successful black man. And I see what his lead attorney, Mark Agnifilo, brought that up essentially. They didn't really flesh that out during the trial, which I thought was an interesting approach. But they did bring it up in the beginning that he is a successful black man and this is government overreach. And the government is trying to prosecute him for his sex life, right? His unconventional but totally legal sex life. But then there's also the fact that Mark Agnifilo said, like, the government's raided his home and, oh my God, they found baby oil. Oh my God, we're so much safer with baby oil off the streets. So I feel like if they continuously try to make this frivolous and a laughing stock, then there may be a way that he is protected and it's framed as the government was trying to take down someone who's an African-American figure who reached heights that we haven't seen any artist, let alone a rap artist, do.
How much do you think, and I'm not going to get into politics at all, but just from a legal perspective, the last big New York trial before this one was the Trump case, right? The polling that followed that was the public felt as if there was some overcharging in that case. I'm not going to opine here whether there was or there was not. A jury found him guilty of certain criminal acts. Do you think that kind of fact? I don't think that the defense brought that up at all, even implicitly. But do you think that there's now this sentiment amongst jurors and potential jurors that the government does overcharge, does overreach, does try to shoehorn facts into novel legal theories to get big wins? I mean, this is being prosecuted by a Trump DOJ, so that there is some tension there. But do you think that factored in at all, like with some of the rhetoric that was used by the defense team, made with an eye towards how the public felt about that last big high profile case?
Yeah, I do agree with you, because of the fact that once everything came out in the beginning, if we felt like, okay, what does the prosecution has been investigating him for a year now, what are they going to bring out, who's going to come forward? And if we could go back to what I was saying about Jane and why I don't think Jane helped the prosecution's case, is because Jane was somebody who, even the prosecution established, was someone who dated famous men. The father of her child is another famous rapper who's wildly successful. She was around other wildly successful rappers. She was angry at Diddy, and every time she pushed back against a freak off, it's because she didn't, either she wasn't comfortable, which, I mean, there were plenty of text messages where she said, this is degrading to me, I don't want to do this. But then there were text messages where she would point out that Other women that he was dating were getting better Chanel bags than her. They were getting trips. She wanted to be on his yacht. And he was also part of the coercion that they were trying to establish, is that he was paying her rent. And there was a financial incentive for her to continue these freak offs where he was, I think he was paying he agreed to pay $10,000 a month for her place that she was living. And she felt like she couldn't break it off because then she would lose the roof over her head. But I also think that when you have a jury of 8 men and 4 women who live in New York, not many of us are living in $10,000 apartments or homes that someone else is paying, right? And so I don't think that that resonated with the jurors as much as Cassie's testimony, for example. And I do think that then when all of that came out, a lot of people were saying, well, yeah, rich men pay for things for beautiful women, and this just feels like a transactional relationship. And then they fly them across state lines sometimes to meet them in New York, to meet them in Miami. How is this different than what other successful men are doing? And then it kind of fed into that narrative, like you said, that the government is trying to prosecute him for things that other rich men do, and that has been happening for a long time.
This to me felt like prosecution overcomplicated their theory of the case and stretched the case out for way too long. When I was a prosecutor, and I wasn't a federal prosecutor, I was a state prosecutor, what I always try to do when I was thinking about my cases is, if I was stuck with the jury in an elevator for 30 seconds, could I explain the case to them in 30 seconds? And how do I do that? Because at the end of the day, that's really what you want the jury to be able to quickly understand why the person is guilty. And I never felt like, I think you have to sit down for 20 minutes to explain to a jury how the facts fit into the legal theory here. So after watching all the testimony unfold, how superfluous do you think some of the testimony was? Like, in an ideal world, how long would this trial have been, and how could the prosecution have been a little more effective in prevailing its theory upon the jury?
Yeah, I honestly think it could have been at least 2 to 3 weeks shorter. By the last 2 weeks, we're hearing from a lot of summary witness and maybe like Homeland Security agents who were going over the same things about, I confiscated this laptop, or this is the laptop that we removed, this is what we did to submit into evidence, this was the chain of command. And you could see that the jury was just not engaged, and it was not something that they could sit there for hours and be fully focused on. So I do definitely think it could be shorter. I also think the way they explained RICO was complicated. It was hard for me to even explain to the audience about, like, this is what the charge is, this is what they need to establish. And I don't think throughout the entire 8 weeks fully established what was this enterprise and how was it separate than his legitimate businesses. Because if you are someone who is a mogul, as he was, you're going to have assistants, you're going to have security. He's insanely famous all over the world. You're going to have all these people around you. How does this turn into then an enterprise? And how does it turn into racketeering conspiracy? And I actually think it wasn't until the closing argument that they finally said he was at the head. He's the boss. Then they have his loyal lieutenants, Christina Quorum, who was his chief of staff, who was the one who was calling the shots. Then there were the security guards that were his, the brute, right? The force that would get the job done. Then there were his army of assistants. And that was the first time during the closing argument that they finally established what even the hierarchy was, or they put it into terms where, RICO is a law that was established for the mob and the mafia, and they never fully explained, okay, well, this is how the chain of command worked. This is what the enterprise was. This is what the enterprise entailed. Instead, they would just keep bringing these random people up throughout the trial, and it was only at the end that they established, this is where the chain of command, this is how the chain of command was.
Do you think if they forgot RICO and just pursued a sex trafficking case and that was it, and maybe some of the predicate felonies, I don't know to what extent they were chargeable federally, would that have been more effective? Because it seemed like they had it felt almost defensive. Like, we're not sure if they're getting RICO, so we're just going to throw all these witnesses up onto the stand and hope that volume works, like just volume of testimony. In my former life, prosecuted and defended sex trafficking cases. No longer I'm a criminal attorney, but you don't want to overcomplicate it. Like, it's not really meant to be it's not an insider trading, um, financial crimes case with thousands of documents. It's testimony and facts. So do you think it would have been more effective if RICO wasn't part of the charging instrument?
I think so, because they tried to weave RICO in throughout the entire trial. So even when they were talking about sex trafficking, they would still try to use it as a predicate act, right? Or establish it as a predicate act. And it was hard to kind of distinguish when they were trying to talk about RICO and what was supposed to be as part of building a case, the RICO case, and what was building the sex trafficking case. And I think ultimately it kind of just all fell short because it was too hard to follow. And there were, like you said, too many people that they were calling. I also think, again, the sex trafficking, I do wonder, and I don't know if I could say if he would have been convicted of sex trafficking had they not charged him with RICO. And the reason why I say that is because in the beginning, this case was so sensationalized. The minute they found out that, after all the civil lawsuits came out, a lot of people were saying, are there minors involved? We heard that there were minors, there was allegations about minors being involved. There were allegations that there were multiple women, and that there were multiple women and men. And when the government produced 4 victims and 2 for sex trafficking, the third one didn't even show up. Then it was like, okay, well, how? I assume, like, and I know that it's totally possible to do it, but I think in lay people, for lay people, they feel like sex trafficking is an operation. There's a lot of people involved. There's money involved. It's not 2 people that you have a relationship with. And so it's hard to apply what people think sex trafficking is, or what the law is, as opposed to what people think sex trafficking is in the outside world.
I mean, I didn't listen to the opening statement, Raquel. I don't know if you did. That's an opening statement problem. That's where you either have to under promise and over deliver. If you're not sure, they're going to have certain witnesses come in. And you also need to do a very good job in a case like this, laying out a roadmap for the jury and telling them not to worry about like trying to connect all the dots during the course of the case. But like, this is the roadmap. This is who you're going to hear from, but don't worry about like figuring out how that fits into the organized crime element, because it's not going to make sense to you while you're listening to the testimony. We'll come back at the end and kind of explain that to you, but you shouldn't be trying to like work overtime to figure that out yourselves. So I don't know if they did that, and how effectively they did that, but it sounds like that's an opening statement issue that they had. Raquel, do you have any last thoughts or rants about Reddit holes or TikTok?
Interestingly enough, I did not go on Reddit for this this case. Mona, what you were saying before about, when all the civil lawsuits were coming out, and there was like all these people that were coming out of the woodwork saying, this is what happened to me, and this is what happened to me, and even just like reading about it, it seemed that at a certain point there was like, and I'm probably over exaggerating, but like hundreds of people that were coming out with these civil lawsuits against Diddy, and then to have the actual, trial happen and only have 2 people testify about the sex trafficking, it felt like, as someone just consuming it publicly, how I was reading about it, how I was seeing videos about it, it felt like, the odds were really stacked against Diddy in this case, and how so many people were going to say, like, testify and say, this is, this is my experience, and then to have the actual testimony be, it felt like it, even like hearing about it, it felt like it really landed mostly on Kathy's shoulders, and like how they were sort of relying on her to carry this case through and these charges against Diddy through. Just having it like unfold the way that it did, it felt like the momentum of the case didn't actually carry through the actual trial.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think one of the things that Mark Agnifilo immediately pointed out, this is during his arraignment, was saying during the initial indictment, they only had 1 victim, and it was Cassie. And the indictment mirrored her lawsuit. Everything that was in her lawsuit was including even some of the incidences, and the people that were involved in those incidences were the people that ended up testifying. And so it felt like, as you said, a lot of this was on Cassie's shoulders. Like, she was the star witness. She was the outline for their case. And then they brought in Jane, which I don't know, again, did that help or even hurt them? But she was able to also say that this happened. So they were able to establish a pattern. Then there was Gina, who just went missing. And that was strange as well. They were supposed to have a whole another victim that was someone that he dated and was brought up. Then there was the big question of, where is Christina Coram? Because her name has been brought up so many times. They're calling her a co-conspirator, but you haven't indicted anyone else. But yet this is supposed to be this big enterprise, this, RICO conspiracy, but you don't have any co-conspirators listed on the indictment. And so I think it, like you said, it didn't turn out to be what initially people thought it was. And that's why I think a lot of people were like, oh, this was a big nothing burger then. For the jurors, I think it was just hard to follow and connect everything that was happening.
Okay, well, Mona, I think we could probably go on for maybe not 8 weeks, but 8 hours talking about this. But we've taken up a lot of your time. Might want to have you come back on after the sentencing is rendered, so we can talk about that. But if people want to hear more from you, check you out, hear what you have to say about anything going on in the whether it's Diddy trial or the pop culture universe or otherwise, where can they go?
Yeah, I put all my updates on Twitter, or not Twitter. Take it back there. I put all my updates on TikTok at MoKoAb, MoKoAb, and then also my Instagram, Mona K Abdi.
Okay, well, you should definitely check her out. I know Raquel was fastidiously following her during the course of the Diddy trial, and I'm sure she'll follow her for whatever the next big event is. We really appreciate your time, and we'll see what happens in October.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
For more on all things real estate and the law, subscribe to this and our other podcasts. Follow Bergstein, Flynn, Knowlton, and Polina on social media. Subscribe to our newsletter and go to bfklawoffice.com. That's bfklawoffice.com to learn more.